He lived in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone thought they knew each other. His house was modest but well kept. A small garden in the front with flowers that bloomed in bright colors during the spring. People passing by often waved, and he waved back with a calm smile, the kind that made you feel like he was the kind of neighbor you could trust. He liked things simple. He liked the morning sun spilling through his window, the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen, and the soft hum of life that went on quietly around him. He worked hard not for wealth or recognition, but for a sense of normalcy. Every day was about small routines, getting up early, making breakfast, walking to work, and coming back home to tend to his plants or read a book. The neighborhood wasn't perfect. There were whispers sometimes, tensions that rose and fell like the wind, but he had learned to navigate them carefully. People assumed he was just another ordinary man, maybe a little quiet, maybe a little serious. No one would have guessed the truth about him. No one could have imagined the life he had left behind, the things he had done or the skills he carried in silence. But right now all of that seemed distant, almost like a memory from someone else's life. He had settled into this peaceful existence because he wanted to leave the past behind, to live without the shadows of danger or violence. One evening, as he returned from work, he noticed something unusual. The streets were quieter than normal, and there was an uneasy feeling in the air, like the calm before a storm. He shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe he was overreacting. But as he approached his home, the sight made his stomach drop. His front gate had been kicked in. The small flowers he had planted were trampled and broken. The door to his house was hanging open, the lock smashed. He froze for a moment, his mind racing. This was not a mistake or a petty act of vandalism, it was deliberate. Inside, the damage was worse. Furniture was overturned, walls were scratched with hateful words, and the living room bore the marks of a home that had been violated. Pictures from his family trips lay shattered on the floor. His belongings were tossed around, some broken, some missing. The chaos was not just physical, it was personal. It was a statement meant to frighten and humiliate. He walked slowly through the house, his eyes taking in every detail, his heart heavy with anger and disbelief. How could anyone do this, and why? He knew immediately who was behind it. There had been whispers in the neighborhood for months about a group of men who didn't welcome people like him. They made jokes, spread rumors, and created an invisible wall of fear. He had tried to ignore them, to keep his life private, but it seemed their hatred had finally turned into action. Even so, the reality of seeing his home destroyed was far worse than he had imagined. Neighbors began to gather, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. Some offered words of sympathy, but there were no real answers. The police came, took notes, and promised to investigate. But there was a sense of dismissiveness in their tone, a subtle suggestion that this was just another petty incident. It was infuriating. He wanted to shout at them, to make them understand the severity of what had happened, but he restrained himself. He had learned long ago that patience and careful thought were far more powerful than rash action. Sitting on the steps of his ruined porch, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. The anger was there, boiling beneath the surface, but so was something else, calm. Years of discipline and training had taught him to control his emotions, to measure his reactions. He could feel the memories stirring, the skills he had honed in situations far more dangerous than this. The military had taught him to survive, to fight, and to plan, but it had also taught him restraint. He had chosen a quiet life now, but the instinct to protect and to respond was still alive. As night fell, he walked through the neighborhood, looking for signs of who had done this. He noticed small things, footprints, tire marks, discarded items that could give clues. He observed quietly, making mental notes, his eyes sharp and alert. No one suspected that the calm, polite man they knew could notice so much or understand its significance. To them, he was just a neighbor who had been unlucky. But he was anything but unlucky. In the days that followed, he began to rebuild, at least in small ways. He cleaned up the debris, repaired what he could, and took steps to secure his home. But his mind was working on other things. Plans, strategies, questions about the people who had done this. Who were they? Why had they chosen him? And most importantly, how would he ensure that this never happened again? Evenings were the hardest. He sat quietly, sometimes sipping coffee, sometimes staring out the window, thinking about what had been lost. The house was still a home in structure, but the sense of safety had been shattered. Memories of peaceful mornings, quiet nights, and ordinary conversations felt fragile now. threatened by the knowledge that hatred could strike so directly, but he refused to let fear take hold. He had faced worse before, and he knew he could face this too. He also thought about the people around him, the neighbors who had looked on with mild concern but had done little, the police who had treated the incident as routine, and the larger community that remained unaware of the danger lurking in their midst. Their ignorance was a kind of protection, but it was also a challenge. He realized he would have to handle this carefully. There could be no mistakes, no rash decisions that might put others at risk. At night, when the neighborhood was quiet, he sometimes heard whispers of the past creeping back into his mind. He remembered training exercises, missions in hostile environments, and moments when his life had depended on precision and calm under pressure. The contrast between that life and the one he was now living was stark, almost surreal. But the lessons remained. Patience, observation, discipline, and strategy. These were tools he had not forgotten. He also began to notice the subtle reactions of those around him. A few neighbors approached with more caution, some avoided his house entirely, and some watched from a distance, unsure what to say or do. Their behavior confirmed his assessment. The gang had underestimated him. They believed they were attacking a man who would react like any other, who would be frightened or helpless. They could not have been more wrong. Yet for now, he did nothing overt. He repaired the damage as best he could, maintained his routines, and continued to act as if life were returning to normal. Inside, however, he was planning. Every movement, every action was being calculated, not with anger alone, but with precision. He would respond, but it would be measured. He would show them that their hatred and their violence were meaningless against someone who had been trained to endure and overcome far greater threats. Even as he worked, he kept his interactions natural and unassuming. To his coworkers, he was the same polite, quiet man they had always known. To the neighbors, he smiled, nodded, and chatted casually about mundane matters. No one suspected the depth of his thoughts, the intensity of his observations, or the preparation that was quietly underway. That was the advantage of living a life like his. People assumed ordinary things about him because they had never seen the extraordinary. As days turned into a week, the initial shock of the attack began to fade, replaced by a steady determination. He refused to be broken or intimidated. Every piece of furniture replaced, every wall repainted, and every repair made was a statement of resilience. He was not defeated. He was not frightened. And he was not done observing, calculating, and preparing. The neighborhood, unaware of the storm quietly forming in their midst, continued its rhythm. Life went on as it always did, oblivious to the silent force that now watched over it. But he knew that the quiet before the storm was always the most dangerous part. The gang had made a grave mistake. They had assumed that ordinary appearances equaled ordinary capability. They had no idea who they had provoked. And so, life continued outwardly as before. But the man at the center of this unfolding story was anything but ordinary. Every night, every moment, he reminded himself of the past, of the skills he had honed, and of the discipline that would guide him forward. Patience, observation, and precision were his tools. He would act when the time was right, and when he did, the consequences would be undeniable. For now, he remained calm, tending to his garden, walking the familiar streets, and interacting with neighbors. But inside, the quiet mind of a trained Navy SEAL was already at work, plotting, observing, and preparing. One thing was certain. No one had yet seen the full extent of what he was capable of, and when the moment came, the world would understand that the man they assumed was quiet and ordinary was, in truth, extraordinarily dangerous and fiercely determined to restore what had been taken from him. After the attack, he spent long hours at home, not just repairing the damage but thinking. His mind was restless, replaying every detail of that night. The sound of the door crashing open, the smell of destruction, the hateful messages scrawled across his walls. He kept remembering the way the neighborhood had watched, some in shock, some in silent judgment, all of them unaware of what lay beneath his calm exterior. He felt the familiar mix of anger and clarity. Anger at the injustice, clarity in knowing what needed to happen next. It was late at night when he allowed himself to sit quietly and let the past rise in his mind. He had left that life behind deliberately. The Navy had been a world apart, a life full of danger, precision, and decisions that could mean life or death. For years he had been part of missions that most people couldn't even imagine. situations where one wrong move could cost countless lives. He had trained for months, learned to push his body and mind to limits no ordinary person could endure, and had walked away not because he wanted fame, but because he wanted peace. Yet, peace was fragile. He had chosen a quiet life, but he had never forgotten the discipline, the vigilance, and the skills that had kept him alive in situations that seemed hopeless. He thought about his old training, the drills that taught him patience, strategy, and observation. The same lessons that had saved him in hostile territories could now guide him here, in his own neighborhood, against people who had made the mistake of underestimating him. He was no longer in the battlefield of the Navy, but the principles were the same. He could watch, wait, and act decisively when the time was right. In the following days, he began to plan quietly. He did not rush. That was never his way. His first step was observation. He started paying attention to details others overlooked. He noticed cars parked in unusual places, people loitering near certain houses, and faces that seemed familiar in an unsettling way. The gang had left traces, small things they didn't think mattered, but he could read them. Footsteps, the way doors were left unlocked, and patterns in their behavior. All of it told him something. He recorded it mentally, storing every observation for later. He also considered his neighbors. Some had been frightened by the attack, others dismissive. Few understood the danger, and none realized that the man they had assumed was ordinary had skills that could rival anyone in that gang. He had learned long ago not to reveal too much. People judged appearances, and he had always used that to his advantage. The calm demeanor, the quiet presence, the polite nods and casual conversations, all of it was a mask, one that allowed him to move unnoticed while the mind beneath calculated and prepared. Even during work, his thoughts were partly elsewhere. He kept his focus on the tasks at hand, but his mind wandered to strategies, possibilities, and contingencies. He knew that anger alone was useless. It could make people reckless. He had seen too many reckless actions in life to ever repeat them. What was needed was patience, observation, and careful planning. Every move had to count. He began to map the gang in his mind, considering their strengths, weaknesses, habits, and fears. Every detail would be useful when the time came to act. At home, he started preparing in more practical ways, too. He secured his house further, installing cameras, reinforcing locks, and creating a sense of order where chaos had recently reigned. But the preparations went beyond the physical. He trained quietly every evening, pushing himself, remembering old drills, practicing precision and control. It wasn't about revenge yet. It was about readiness. If the time came to confront the gang, he would not be caught unprepared. Every movement, every reaction had to be deliberate. At night, he often walked through the neighborhood. The streets were familiar, but now they seemed different, almost like a chessboard. Each person and object a piece in a larger game. He noticed things he hadn't before. The quiet glances exchanged, the suspicious pauses at intersections, the small signs that tension was growing. He didn't act impulsively. He watched, waited, and learned. The gang thought they had intimidated him, but in truth they had revealed themselves. They had underestimated someone who could read patterns, predict behavior, and act with lethal precision if necessary. He also reflected on himself. He was not a man seeking to harm others for the sake of anger or pride. He wanted justice, a restoration of peace, and a way to make sure his home and the community was safe. He knew the difference between revenge and responsibility. His training had taught him that one could easily slide into recklessness if driven by raw emotion. He was not reckless. He was deliberate, and he understood that deliberate action carried power far beyond brute force. As the days passed, he began to notice more subtle things about the gang. Some of them were careless, leaving clues about their movements and intentions. Others were cautious, aware that someone might be watching but not aware of just how closely. He recorded everything in his mind, the times they moved, the places they gathered, and the dynamics within the group. Each observation was another piece of the puzzle, another step toward understanding how to act effectively when the time was right. While observing, he never let himself be seen as threatening. He smiled at neighbors, joked lightly with coworkers, and maintained the routine of ordinary life. To anyone looking from the outside, he was the same calm, polite man who had lived in the neighborhood for years. That was his advantage. The mask of ordinariness hid a mind that was anything but ordinary. No one suspected that beneath that calm exterior was someone trained to survive and dominate under extreme circumstances. At home, he also revisited old lessons. He thought about situational awareness, about how to anticipate danger before it struck, and how to control a situation without letting emotions dictate outcomes. These were not just military lessons, they were life lessons. He understood human behavior, the psychology of fear and aggression, and how to use observation to turn situations in his favor. The gang thought they had power over him, but in truth, the power dynamics were quietly shifting. Despite the careful planning and constant vigilance, he allowed himself small moments of humanity. He tended to his garden, spoke with neighbors, and went about daily life in a way that kept him grounded. This balance was crucial. He could not let the anger consume him, nor could he let the situation dominate his existence. He lived in both worlds, the ordinary and the extraordinary, drawing strength from each. The calm and routine of daily life gave him the patience to wait. The skills and discipline from the past gave him the ability to act decisively when the moment came. Occasionally, he thought about confronting the gang directly. The urge was there, natural and strong, but he knew the risk of acting prematurely. He had learned that careful planning and patience produced results far superior to impulsive action. One wrong move could escalate the situation, endanger others, or reveal his identity. He could wait. He could prepare. And when he acted, it would be precise, effective, and undeniable. Late at night, he sometimes reflected on the strange duality of his life. Here he was, a man who had seen and survived extraordinary danger, living a quiet suburban life, planning silently while maintaining a mask of normalcy. It was a strange balance, but one he had learned to maintain. The neighborhood had no idea what it had overlooked, and the gang had no idea who they were challenging. To them, he was just a man who had been unlucky. In truth, he was a force they could not comprehend, one that had already begun preparing for the reckoning. He also considered the broader implications of their attack. It wasn't just about his house. It was about respect, justice, and the principle that hatred should not go unchallenged. He felt a responsibility not only to himself but to the community, to ensure that the gang could not terrorize anyone else. His actions would not be about fear or revenge. They would be about restoration and protection. Every observation, every step, every plan was guided by that principle. And so he continued. Each day brought new details, new observations, and new preparation. He moved through life with a calm exterior, but inside his mind was alert, calculating, and ready. He was patient, deliberate, and disciplined, knowing that the time for action would come, and when it did, nothing would be left to chance. The past, once buried, was now a guide. The skills, the discipline, the ability to see through chaos and act with precision, they were all alive, ready, and waiting. The neighborhood had no idea who lived among them. The gang had no idea who they had provoked. And he, the man they thought they had intimidated, would remain patient, observing, and planning until the moment was right. For now, the quiet life continued outwardly. He smiled at neighbors, worked during the day, and tended to his home. But beneath the calm, a storm was quietly forming, one guided by experience, skill, and determination. One day the balance would tip. One day the reckoning would arrive. And when it did, the world would understand that the man they assumed was ordinary was anything but. By now he had spent several weeks quietly observing, thinking, and preparing. The attack on his home had left a scar, not just on his property but on his sense of safety. But he refused to let it define him. Each day he reminded himself that patience and careful planning were far more powerful than acting on impulse. The gang had made a mistake thinking he would react recklessly. They didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know that he was watching, noting, and preparing. He began the next stage of his plan, gathering intelligence. He needed to understand the gang completely, their numbers, their routines, their weaknesses, and the ways they influenced the neighborhood. He couldn't act without knowing everything. One mistake could undo all the careful work he had done. Every detail mattered, no matter how small. He started with surveillance. During his walks in the neighborhood, he paid close attention to people's movements. He noticed which houses the gang members frequented, the cars they drove, and the times they tended to gather in groups. Some of them were careless, leaving doors unlocked or carrying items that revealed more than they realized. Others were cautious, but even caution had a pattern, and patterns could be studied. He recorded everything in his mind, building a mental map of the gang's behavior, strengths, and vulnerabilities. At work, he kept his demeanor calm and ordinary. To his co-workers, he was just a man who had experienced an unfortunate event at home. He smiled politely, answered questions casually, and shared small talk without revealing any hint of his deeper plans. Maintaining this facade was crucial. If the gang suspected that he was watching and gathering information, they might change their routines, making his task more difficult. They needed to believe he was just another ordinary man, upset but harmless. He also paid attention to how the gang interacted with the neighborhood. Some of the members tried to intimidate others, showing their power through loud voices, threats, and reckless behavior. Others were subtler, creating an undercurrent of fear that spread quietly. By observing them, he could see their hierarchy: the leaders, the followers, and those who acted out of insecurity. Understanding these dynamics would be key to dismantling them effectively. Every night he returned home and reviewed what he had observed during the day. He thought about each encounter, each movement, and each detail he had noticed. It was like assembling a puzzle. He imagined the gang's world as a board, with each person a piece. By understanding how the pieces moved and interacted, he could predict their actions and exploit their mistakes. The more he observed, the more confident he became that he could control the situation without exposing himself. Sometimes he found subtle clues that made him smile quietly to himself. A careless gesture, a forgotten item, a whispered conversation. These small details gave him insight into their routines and priorities. They thought they were clever, but in truth, they were predictable. Every pattern he uncovered was another tool, another advantage in a situation they did not even realize existed. While gathering intelligence, he also tested their boundaries. He would pass near them, sometimes casually nodding, other times engaging in light conversation. He gauged their reactions, observing how easily they were rattled or how confidently they presented themselves. He learned to read expressions, tones, and gestures. Even the smallest twitch or glance told him more than words ever could. This was the difference between fear and control. He wasn't trying to provoke them, he was trying to understand them. In parallel, he strengthened his home and personal defenses. He installed discreet cameras that allowed him to monitor the property without drawing attention. He reinforced doors and windows in ways that were subtle but effective. These measures weren't just for protection, they were also part of the psychological game. A gang that could not operate with impunity would start to make mistakes, and mistakes were what he needed. He also reached out to people in the neighborhood in subtle ways. Small conversations, friendly gestures, and quiet presence allowed him to observe others' attitudes toward the gang. Some were fearful, some dismissive, and a few were quietly sympathetic. By listening and watching, he began to understand how the gang's actions affected the broader community, and which allies or informants might exist if the situation escalated. This was not about seeking help. It was about gathering context, understanding the environment, and using information wisely. Every observation was paired with reflection. He thought about human behavior, about fear, pride, and aggression. He considered how people acted when they believed themselves in control versus when they felt vulnerable. These lessons from the past, combined with his present observations, allowed him to anticipate the gang's next moves. He began to develop scenarios in his mind, imagining each possible reaction and how he would respond. The mental preparation was rigorous, precise, and methodical. Even with all this careful observation, he made sure not to become consumed by it. He maintained his routines, smiled at neighbors, tended to his home, and moved through life as if nothing had changed. This outward calm was essential. If the gang suspected that he was studying them, they might act unpredictably, and unpredictability was dangerous. He needed to remain a shadow, unnoticed and underestimated. The more he observed, the more patterns became clear. Some members were reckless, quick to anger, and easy to manipulate. Others were cautious but overconfident in their own intelligence. He saw who influenced decisions, who followed blindly, and who might be swayed with the right pressure. This understanding became the foundation of his plan. It was not enough to react. He had to act strategically, hitting the group in ways that minimized risk to himself and others while maximizing the effect. He also noticed their vulnerabilities beyond behavior. Financial habits, routines outside, the neighborhood, and personal distractions all provided openings. Some members had jobs that required them to leave at predictable times. Some carried grudges that could be exploited. He made mental notes of everything, treating it like assembling a map that would guide him to the right moment to act. Throughout this process, he reminded himself to stay calm and focused. The anger from the attack on his home could have driven reckless actions, but he refused to let it. He had survived far greater dangers by controlling his emotions and thinking clearly. This was no different. His training had taught him patience, observation, and precision, and those lessons were now more relevant than ever. He also considered the ethical side of what he planned. He did not seek unnecessary violence. His goal was justice, restoration, and protection. Any action he would take had to be calculated, effective, and justifiable. He reflected on the mistakes he had seen others make when blinded by anger, and he vowed not to repeat them. The intelligence-gathering phase was about preparation, not confrontation. Even as he moved through this phase, he found moments of quiet reflection. He thought about how quickly lives could be disrupted by hate, how fragile the sense of safety was, and how much strength it took to remain patient in the face of injustice. These thoughts strengthened his resolve. He was not just preparing for the gang, he was preparing to protect his home, his dignity, and his community. By the end of the third week, he had collected enough information to start seeing the bigger picture. The gang's routines were clear, their weaknesses identified, and their structure understood. He could anticipate their moves, predict their mistakes, and plan actions that would neutralize their influence without unnecessary risk. The stage was set. The calm, quiet man in the neighborhood was far from ordinary, and the gang had no idea how outmatched they were, even though they believed themselves in control. He also considered timing. Acting too soon could alert them, while waiting too long could let them recover from past mistakes. He needed to strike at the right moment, when their vulnerabilities and his preparation aligned perfectly. The intelligence-gathering phase had taught him more than he expected. It had shown him the gang's arrogance, carelessness, and overconfidence. Those traits would be crucial when the moment of action arrived. He continued his routine, blending observation with ordinary life. He smiled at neighbors, attended work, and tended to his home, all while mentally rehearsing scenarios, refining strategies, and testing assumptions. Every day added layers of understanding and preparedness. By now he felt a quiet confidence. He was ready, but the moment had not yet come. Patience was key, and patience had always been one of his greatest strengths. Even as he prepared, he maintained empathy for those affected. He thought about neighbors who had been afraid, families who had suffered quietly, and others who had faced intimidation from the gang. He was not acting out of personal vendetta alone. He was protecting the community, and every decision reflected that sense of responsibility. His intelligence gathering was a way to safeguard lives, restore order, and ensure that the gang could not harm anyone else. As the nights passed, he felt the quiet thrill of anticipation. The pieces were falling into place. Observation had revealed weaknesses, patterns, and opportunities. Preparation had given him control, insight, and strategy. And patience had ensured that when action came, it would be precise, deliberate, and decisive. The gang had thought they were powerful, but they had underestimated someone who had spent years learning to survive, to adapt, and to dominate situations far more dangerous than anything they could imagine. He walked the streets one evening, as he often did, noticing subtle shifts. A member of the gang lingered too long outside a house. Another fumbled with a car lock, and yet another spoke too loudly, revealing intentions that should have remained hidden. Each observation added to the mental map he had been building, creating a framework that would guide his next steps. He felt a sense of satisfaction, quiet and controlled. This was the work of preparation, not action. He had learned long ago that preparation was as powerful as execution. And so, life continued outwardly as normal. To neighbors, he was the same polite, quiet man who had suffered an unfortunate attack. To the gang, he remained a shadow, underestimated and unnoticed. But beneath that calm exterior, a storm was quietly forming. Every observation, every note, every calculation had brought him closer to the moment when he would act. And when that moment came, it would be clear to everyone that the man they had dismissed as ordinary was, in fact, extraordinarily skilled, disciplined, and ready to reclaim what had been taken from him. After weeks of careful observation and planning, he finally felt ready to move beyond watching. The intelligence he had gathered was complete. Every routine, every weakness, every pattern in the gang's behavior was clear in his mind. He knew which members acted recklessly, who followed orders without question, and who were the key figures in their small world of intimidation. The moment had come to act, but he reminded himself that precision was everything. This was not about anger or revenge. It was about restoring order, protecting his home, and sending a message that hate could not go unchecked. He started small, taking subtle steps that would weaken the gang without drawing attention. The first move was to disrupt their confidence. He left small signs of awareness, subtle changes in his routine that the gang could notice but not fully understand. A light left on in a corner they thought they had scouted, a door quietly reinforced, a noise they couldn't place. These small actions began to plant seeds of doubt. Confidence was fragile, and he knew that even small cracks could grow into chaos for those who thrived on control. He also began to cut off their resources quietly. Members of the gang relied on certain local connections, opportunities, and routines that gave them power. He used what he had learned to make those connections unreliable. Deliveries would be missed, access points blocked, and distractions created in ways that were almost invisible. He did not confront them directly yet, but the environment around them began to shift. The gang sensed change, a quiet resistance that they could not identify. Their small sense of power was slipping, and they did not know why. At the same time, he used the information he had gathered to create pressure points. Certain members were prone to overconfidence or arrogance. He created situations that exposed those traits, letting them make mistakes that would weaken their group dynamic. One would act hastily and embarrass themselves. Another would argue over a minor misunderstanding, and yet another would show fear at a moment that seemed insignificant. Every reaction was observed, every mistake recorded. He let them unravel themselves while he remained calm, patient, and invisible. He was methodical. Each action was planned to have maximum effect with minimum risk. He avoided confrontations that could escalate unnecessarily or expose him. Violence was not the goal. Precision was. He wanted the gang to face consequences that were unavoidable, not because he had attacked them, but because they had acted recklessly, revealing themselves in ways they could not control. The difference between chaos and order was clear in his mind, and he worked carefully to tip the balance in his favor. At night, he often reflected on the lessons of patience and observation. Every move he made during his time in the Navy had been about strategy, about understanding the opponent, and about acting decisively when the moment was right. Those lessons were alive in him now. He didn't need to rush. The gang had exposed themselves through their arrogance and hatred. It was only a matter of waiting until their mistakes aligned with his plan. Timing, he knew, was everything. He also paid attention to the community around the gang. Many neighbors were afraid to speak, but he noticed subtle signs of fear and avoidance. Some people inadvertently helped him by their reactions, giving him insight into the gang's influence and how it could be disrupted. He began to build a mental map not just of the gang, but of the environment that allowed them to operate. Understanding the context meant he could dismantle their power in a way that was permanent. As he moved, he remained careful to maintain his ordinary persona. To outsiders, he was still the polite, quiet man who had suffered an unfortunate attack on his home. He smiled, waved, and chatted with neighbors as if life had returned to normal. This mask was critical. The gang needed to continue underestimating him. Every action he took, every subtle disruption was invisible to them, a shadowed hand guiding events while remaining unseen. He started to exploit their predictable routines in small but impactful ways. A member who drove recklessly would be subtly distracted by something he had arranged. A meeting between gang members would be interrupted by a minor inconvenience that forced them to rethink plans. Each intervention was calculated. He watched them make mistakes that seemed natural, but were in fact carefully orchestrated. It was a quiet, invisible dominance, one that relied on intelligence and observation rather than brute force. At the same time, he began to expose their misdeeds to authorities and the community. He left evidence of their wrongdoing in places where it could be found by police or reported by neighbors, but always in ways that could not be traced back to him. Hateful graffiti, minor theft, reckless behavior. These things were now documented and visible to the system they had once believed they could control. The gang felt pressure from every side, though they didn't understand why. Their influence was slipping and the cracks in their confidence were becoming visible. Throughout all of this, he remained careful to protect himself. Every step was measured to avoid detection. He did not confront them physically unless absolutely necessary. He relied on strategy, observation, and careful manipulation of circumstances. He had faced far greater danger than this in the past, and he understood that control, patience, and precise action were always stronger than rage or impulsive action. As the days passed, the gang became increasingly erratic. They sensed that something was wrong, but could not identify the source. Arguments broke out within their ranks. Confidence faltered, and smaller members began to show fear. He continued to watch, noting every reaction and adjusting his plans accordingly. Each mistake they made was a tool he could use, each misstep a way to dismantle their sense of control. He also began to reclaim his home fully. Repairs were completed, security measures reinforced, and the garden restored. Each step of restoration was a declaration that he would not be intimidated. His home was no longer just a place to live. It had become a symbol of resilience, a fortress that reflected both his ordinary life and his extraordinary capabilities. The gang, even as they plotted and schemed, could not undo what he had rebuilt. At work, his colleagues noticed nothing. He was calm, composed, and engaged as always. To them, he had survived an unfortunate event and was returning to normal life. This contrast between perception and reality was deliberate. He wanted to move like a shadow among them, unseen but fully aware of everything. This careful balance between outward normalcy and inward strategy gave him an edge the gang could never anticipate. He also considered the ethics of his actions. He was not seeking unnecessary harm. He wanted justice and protection, not vengeance for its own sake. Every move was about exposing truth, creating accountability, and ensuring the gang could no longer manipulate or intimidate others. By acting indirectly, strategically, and invisibly, he maintained the moral high ground while dismantling their power. One evening, he noticed a subtle opportunity. A key member of the gang had left behind evidence of a minor crime, an oversight that revealed both carelessness and arrogance. He acted quietly, ensuring that the evidence reached the proper channels without exposing himself. Within hours, the consequences began to unfold. This was how he worked: small, precise actions that multiplied into significant results. The gang's mistakes were no longer just minor slips. They were becoming the foundation of their undoing. As he watched from a distance, he could see the tension growing. The gang members began to question each other, blaming mistakes and arguing over leadership. Their control over the neighborhood faltered. People who had once been afraid now observed with cautious optimism. The balance of power had shifted without a single direct confrontation. Every subtle move, every observation, and every intervention had combined into a strategy that was working perfectly. He allowed himself a quiet moment of satisfaction, but not celebration. He knew that success depended on continued patience and precision. One wrong move could alert them or allow them to regroup. He maintained focus, continuing to observe, plan, and act in subtle but impactful ways. The storm he had quietly prepared for was now fully underway, and every step of the gang's unraveling was a testament to his discipline, intelligence, and experience. At night, he walked through the neighborhood, observing the changes. The once bold members of the gang were cautious, uncertain, and vulnerable. They no longer acted with the confidence that had made them dangerous. Their arrogance had been their weakness, and he had exploited it with patience and precision. The neighborhood, still unaware of his full capabilities, began to breathe more freely. Safety was returning piece by piece, through careful planning rather than brute force. Even as the gang's influence waned, he remained vigilant. He knew that pride and anger could make them unpredictable, and he was prepared to respond if necessary. But for now, The strategy of subtle intervention, exposure, and disruption continued to produce results. He had turned their own recklessness against them, dismantling their power without revealing the force behind it. By the end of this phase, he could see the results clearly. The gang was fragmented, vulnerable, and increasingly ineffective. They no longer controlled the neighborhood or instilled fear in those around them. The balance had shifted completely, and the man they had underestimated had done so quietly, methodically, and without drawing attention. His home was safe again, his community more secure, and the sense of injustice that had begun the process had been addressed through strategy, intelligence, and discipline. He reflected on the lessons of this period. Patience was power, observation was strength, and careful action was more effective than anger or impulsiveness. The storm had been controlled not by force alone, but by the application of skill, discipline, and careful planning. And through it all, he had maintained his humanity, his ordinary life, and the moral clarity that had guided him from the beginning. The neighborhood could now feel a subtle shift in the air. Fear had begun to dissipate. Confidence returned slowly to those who had been intimidated. And yet, no one suspected the quiet man among them had orchestrated the entire turning of the tide. He had acted invisibly, strategically, and decisively. The ordinary man they had known was, in truth, a highly trained and disciplined force they could never have anticipated. After weeks of careful observation, intelligence gathering, and precise action, the gang was finally beginning to crumble. They no longer held the power they had once believed was theirs. Their arrogance, carelessness, and overconfidence had been exposed one by one, and the consequences had begun to unfold quietly but effectively. The neighborhood was starting to breathe a little easier. People walked with a subtle confidence they had lost. Families went about their days with less fear, and even those who had been indifferent before began to notice a change in the atmosphere. He watched all of this unfold from his home, sitting in his living room as the evening light filtered through the windows. His home, once violated and destroyed, had been restored. The walls were clean and strong, the furniture arranged neatly, and his garden bloomed again in bright, vibrant colors. But the true restoration went beyond the physical. The sense of safety, dignity, and order had returned, and that was the victory he had been working toward all along. The gang's members had begun to experience the consequences of their actions, though they didn't know who had orchestrated them. Some faced arrests for petty crimes, exposed by evidence he had carefully left for authorities. Others were confronted by neighbors who no longer feared them, emboldened by subtle changes in their environment that had chipped away at the gang's influence. Arguments broke out within their ranks, trust eroded, and their confidence faltered. Their sense of invincibility had been destroyed without a single direct confrontation. He had not acted out of vengeance. His goal had never been to hurt unnecessarily, but to restore balance and protect his home and community. Every move had been precise, measured, and strategic. The gang had been dismantled not by brute force but by intelligence, patience, and careful planning. He had watched them make mistakes, exploited their weaknesses, and allowed them to collapse under their own arrogance. It was a quiet, invisible justice, one that brought peace without unnecessary violence. Neighbors began to notice changes in the behavior of the gang members. Those who had once intimidated families were now hesitant, awkward, and uncertain. People who had stayed inside their homes out of fear now walked with small smiles and cautious confidence. Children played outside more freely, and the small signs of community life returned. The subtle shift in the neighborhood was palpable, and though no one knew the full story, they could feel the restoration of balance. He maintained his ordinary life throughout. He went to work, tended to his home, and interacted with neighbors as if nothing had changed. This calm exterior was important. To the world, he was the same quiet, polite man who had suffered an unfortunate attack on his home. But beneath the surface, he knew the truth. His planning, patience, and strategic actions had created a shift that was complete and irreversible. The neighborhood was safer, and the gang had been exposed for what they truly were: weak, reckless, and powerless against someone who had been underestimated. There were moments when he reflected on how far he had come. Weeks ago, he had been angry, frustrated, and unsure how to respond. The destruction of his home had threatened his sense of safety and normalcy. But through careful planning, observation, and patience, he had transformed a moment of fear into an opportunity to protect, restore, and teach lessons. The satisfaction he felt was quiet, deliberate, and deeply human. It was not the satisfaction of revenge, but of justice and resilience. He also thought about the lessons the gang members would carry forward, even if they didn't realize it. Their arrogance had been their undoing. Their disregard for others had created consequences they could not control, and their failure to anticipate someone quietly observing had exposed their weaknesses. He had acted indirectly, allowing them to reveal their own flaws and face the consequences naturally. It was a methodical, moral, and effective way to restore balance. In the community, people slowly began to speak more openly. Small conversations revealed relief, cautious optimism, and curiosity about the changes they had noticed. Some wondered why the gang's influence had waned so quickly. But no one had any suspicion of the quiet man whose home had been attacked. He remained a figure of calm and normalcy, but he carried with him the knowledge of the full extent of what had been accomplished. As he walked through the neighborhood one evening, he observed the subtle changes in detail. Children played in yards that had once been avoided. Neighbors exchanged friendly greetings, and people moved with a sense of confidence that had been absent. He felt a quiet pride, not in himself, but in the restoration of balance and the protection of those around him. Justice had been served, but it had been delivered thoughtfully, carefully, and without unnecessary harm. He continued to reinforce the lessons he had learned from the past. Patience had been crucial, observation had revealed weaknesses, and precise action had dismantled the gang's power. But most importantly, he understood that moral clarity was essential. He had acted not from anger alone, but from a desire to protect, restore, and maintain integrity. That clarity had guided every decision and ensured that his actions were purposeful and human-centered. Even the gang members themselves were now facing a reckoning. Their mistakes, arrogance, and recklessness had left them exposed, and the consequences were unavoidable. Some were arrested, some were confronted by neighbors, and some left the neighborhood entirely, understanding that the balance of power had shifted. They had underestimated someone they thought was ordinary, and that miscalculation had changed everything. He took time to restore his home fully, not just physically, but emotionally. The garden flourished again, the walls were repaired, and each corner of the house reflected care and order. But beyond the physical restoration, he found a renewed sense of peace. The neighborhood was safer, the influence of hate diminished, and he had regained control over his environment. This sense of restoration was deeply satisfying, not because he had acted violently, but because balance and justice had been restored. He also reflected on his own life. The quiet, ordinary life he had chosen was still possible, but now it was fortified by experience, skill, and understanding. He had faced danger not with recklessness but with intelligence and patience. He had turned fear into opportunity, chaos into order, and weakness into strength. And through it all he had maintained his humanity, empathy, and moral compass. Even as peace returned, he remained vigilant. He knew that complacency could allow old threats to resurface, and he was committed to maintaining the safety and balance he had worked so hard to restore. His vigilance was quiet, deliberate, and unobtrusive, a reflection of the disciplined mind that had guided him through the entire ordeal. He did not need to show power openly. The restoration itself was the proof of his skill and resilience. The neighborhood slowly returned to a rhythm of normal life. People felt safer, families could enjoy their homes without fear, and the subtle influence of hate had been dismantled. Small acts of kindness and friendliness returned, and the community began to rebuild its sense of trust and safety. The impact of his actions was visible in these small, human details: the return of laughter, the freedom to walk the streets without fear, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that justice has been served. He knew that the story would never be fully understood by the community. They would see the changes, feel the safety, and enjoy the restored balance, but they would not know the careful planning, observation, and patience that had made it possible. That was the nature of true strength: quiet, effective, and moral. The world need not know the details, only that the outcome was justice and peace. As he walked past his restored garden one evening, he paused to reflect. The flowers bloomed brightly, the air was calm, and the neighborhood moved with a sense of security that had been missing before. He felt a deep satisfaction, knowing that he had restored not just his home but the sense of safety and dignity for those around him.